I was standing in my command trailer outside Metz in November 1944 when the intelligence officer handed me another batch of decoded German communications. Third Army was about to punch through the Siegfried Line, and once again, we knew exactly where every German division was positioned before they did. The young lieutenant looked puzzled as he watched me read through enemy troop movements that were barely 6 hours old. He asked how we always seemed to know what the Germans were planning. I told him it was because the Germans had made one tiny mistake 3 years earlier, and they still didn't know it. The story goes back to 1940, when German engineers were perfecting their Enigma encryption machine. They had built what they believed was an unbreakable code system. The machine used rotating wheels that scrambled letters according to millions of possible combinations. Every day, German radio operators received new settings that changed how the machine encoded messages. The Germans were so confident in Enigma that they used it for everything from submarine patrol routes to Hitler's personal communications with his generals. But the German engineers added what they thought was an extra security feature. They programmed the machine so that no letter could ever be encoded as itself. If you typed the letter A, the machine would never output the letter A. Same for every other letter in the alphabet. The Germans believed this would make the code stronger because it eliminated the possibility of obvious patterns. They were wrong. This single rule gave British codebreakers at Bletchley Park the opening they needed to crack the entire system. Here's how the mathematics worked. Without that restriction, each letter position had 26 possible outputs. With the restriction, each position had only 25 possible outputs. That doesn't sound like much, but when you're dealing with encryption systems, small reductions in possibilities become enormous computational advantages. The British could eliminate roughly 4% of all potential combinations before they even started calculating.
British cryptographers realized they could use this flaw systematically. They knew that common German words like Wetter for weather appeared in many messages. If they could guess where Wetter appeared in an encrypted message, they could test whether any of those 6 letters matched themselves. If they did, that combination was impossible, and they could eliminate it. This process, called cribs, allowed them to narrow down the daily machine settings from millions of possibilities to hundreds.
The breakthrough came in May 1941 when British naval forces captured U-110, a German submarine that had been depth-charged but hadn't sunk completely. Lieutenant Commander David Balm led a boarding party onto the damaged submarine while it was still afloat. The German crew had abandoned ship, but they hadn't had time to destroy their Enigma machine or the current codebooks. Balm's men hauled out the machine, the rotors, and 3 months' worth of daily settings. They had 12 minutes before the submarine finally went under. That capture gave Bletchley Park the physical evidence they needed to confirm their mathematical theories. British engineers could examine the actual wiring inside Enigma rotors and verify exactly how the anti-reflection rule worked. More importantly, they had genuine German daily settings to test their code-breaking methods against. Within 6 weeks, British cryptographers were reading German naval communications in real time. By 1941, Bletchley Park was reading German naval communications fast enough to reroute Allied convoys around German submarine positions. The German Navy lost 49 submarines in May 1943 alone, partly because British intelligence knew exactly where German U-boats were hunting. Admiral Dönitz suspected his codes were compromised, but German cryptographers insisted Enigma was unbreakable. They ran security tests, but never discovered the fundamental flaw because they were testing the wrong things. The intelligence advantage grew exponentially throughout 1942 and 1943. British codebreakers weren't just reading isolated messages. They were reading the entire German military communications network. Every morning, German commanders sent situation reports to Berlin. Every evening, Berlin sent back orders and intelligence summaries. The British read both directions of traffic, giving them complete visibility into German strategy at every level from individual companies to army groups. The scale of this intelligence operation was staggering. Bletchley Park processed over 4,000 intercepted German messages daily by 1944. They had broken not just the standard Wehrmacht Enigma, but also the more complex Luftwaffe and Navy versions. The facility employed 9,000 people working in 3 shifts around the clock. Stories like these disappear from public memory if you don't actively seek them out. German communications security was so thoroughly compromised that British intelligence officers could predict German tactical movements 24 to 48 hours in advance. I saw the practical results firsthand during the Sicily campaign in July 1943. My 7th Army was racing Monti's 8th Army to Messina, and I needed to know where German defensive positions were strongest. British intelligence handed me decoded German messages showing exactly which roads General Hube considered impassable for tanks and which coastal positions had ammunition shortages. We attacked through the impassable terrain while German gunners were rationing artillery shells. My armored columns covered 100 miles in 72 hours because we knew where the Germans weren't looking. This intelligence shaped every major Allied operation from 1942 onward. During the North Africa campaign, British commanders knew German supply ship schedules and sank 60% of Rommel's fuel deliveries before they reached port. The Germans blamed this on improved British reconnaissance, never suspecting their own communications were being read in real time. Rommel's Africa Corps ran out of fuel repeatedly, not because of production problems in Germany, but because British submarines and aircraft knew exactly when and where German supply convoys would appear. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the tactical advantages. German commanders started noticing patterns they couldn't explain. In October 1942, Rommel reported to Berlin that British forces seemed to anticipate every German tactical move. German supply officers documented that Allied aircraft consistently attacked their convoys at the exact moment when German vehicles were most vulnerable to air attack. These observations were accurate, but German intelligence analysts couldn't identify the source. The Enigma breakthrough influenced D-Day planning more than most people realize. British intelligence read German assessments of potential landing sites and knew that Hitler's generals disagreed about where the invasion would come. They read Rommel's requests for additional coastal fortifications and knew which beach defenses were incomplete. Most importantly, they knew German weather reports and supply schedules, allowing Allied planners to choose timing that would catch German forces at minimum readiness. During the weeks before D-Day, British intelligence intercepted German messages showing that Rommel believed the Allies wouldn't land during rough weather. German meteorologists predicted storms would make landings impossible for at least 2 weeks after June 4th. The Germans were using incomplete weather data because Allied forces had captured or destroyed most German weather stations in the North Atlantic. German commanders planned their leave schedules based on weather predictions they didn't know were wrong. On June 5, 1944, Rommel left Normandy to visit his wife for her birthday. Several other senior German commanders were away from their posts attending a war games exercise in Rennes. German coastal divisions were at minimum alert status because their meteorologists insisted landing conditions would remain impossible. The German 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit within 50 miles of the landing beaches, had half its officers on leave. Enigma intelligence didn't just tell the Allies where German forces were positioned, it told them when those forces would be looking the other way. But the real proof of Enigma's value came during the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. British intelligence shared decrypted German battle plans with Soviet commanders through carefully disguised channels. Stalin's generals knew the exact timing, location, and composition of the German offensive weeks before it began. They positioned 1.3 million Soviet troops and 3,600 tanks in defensive positions that perfectly countered German strategy. The largest tank battle in history was decided before the first shot was fired because Soviet commanders had read Hitler's orders to his field generals. The intelligence was so detailed that Soviet commanders knew which German units would attack first, which roads German supply columns would use, and where German artillery observation posts were located. Soviet engineers built anti-tank positions exactly where German battle plans indicated the main armored thrust would come. Soviet artillery officers pre-positioned their guns to hit German assembly areas that German commanders thought were secret. When Operation Citadel began on July 5, 1943, German forces attacked into killing zones that had been prepared specifically for them. German casualties at Kursk exceeded 200,000 men in 2 weeks. The German army lost 760 tanks and 681 aircraft, including many of their most experienced crews. After Kursk, the German military never again launched a major offensive on the Eastern Front. The defeat wasn't caused by superior Soviet tactics or overwhelming numbers. It was caused by one tiny flaw in an encryption machine that German engineers still thought was perfect. German engineers never discovered their fatal design error. Even after the war, captured German cryptographers insisted that Enigma was mathematically unbreakable. They had calculated correctly that the machine generated 158 million possible daily combinations. What they never calculated was how much computational power the British would gain by eliminating that 4% of impossible combinations. In cryptography, small advantages compound exponentially. I witnessed this intelligence advantage throughout my campaigns in 1944 and 1945. During the breakout from Normandy, British intelligence provided decoded German messages showing that Hitler had ordered his commanders to hold their positions rather than conduct a fighting withdrawal. German generals wanted to retreat to the Seine River and establish new defensive lines, but Hitler insisted they stand and fight. We knew about this disagreement before some German field commanders did. The psychological impact on German commanders was perhaps more devastating than the tactical advantages. By 1944, German officers at every level suspected they were being watched, but they couldn't figure out how. Field commanders reported that Allied forces seemed to anticipate their movements. Supply officers noticed that British aircraft consistently attacked German convoys at the worst possible moments. Intelligence officers documented patterns of Allied success that seemed too consistent to be luck, but they couldn't identify the source. This paranoia degraded German decision-making throughout the final 2 years of the war. Commanders became reluctant to communicate detailed plans over radio, forcing them to rely on slower courier systems that couldn't coordinate complex operations effectively. Some German units stopped using radio communications entirely for sensitive operations, which isolated them from higher command and reduced tactical flexibility. The cure became almost as damaging as the disease. German commanders started using code words and euphemisms in their radio traffic, but this actually made their communications easier to decode. When German officers said they were visiting their grandmother, British intelligence quickly figured out this meant retreating to secondary defensive positions. When German supply officers reported they were feeding the horses, this meant ammunition resupply operations. The more creative Germans became with their language, the more obvious their patterns became to professional codebreakers. The numbers tell the complete story. Between 1940 and 1945, British intelligence read approximately 2.5 million German military messages. These intercepts influenced the outcome of every major campaign from the Battle of Britain through the final assault on Berlin. Military historians estimate that Enigma intelligence shortened the European war by at least 18 months, saving millions of lives and preventing Germany from completing advanced weapons programs that might have changed the outcome. The scale of the intelligence operation was unprecedented in military history. Bletchley Park didn't just read German military communications. They read Gestapo messages, German police reports, Nazi party correspondence, and diplomatic cables between Berlin and neutral countries. By 1944, British intelligence knew more about German military capabilities than most German generals. They read Hitler's personal messages to his field commanders and knew about strategic disagreements within the German high command before those disagreements were resolved. British intelligence even read German technical reports about new weapons development. They knew about V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets months before these weapons were first used against London. They read German test reports from Peenemünde and knew the range, accuracy, and production schedules for German secret weapons. Allied bombing raids destroyed German rocket facilities because British intelligence knew exactly which buildings contained the most critical equipment. The intelligence advantage extended to economic and industrial information. British codebreakers read German reports about fuel shortages, ammunition production problems, and transportation difficulties. They knew which German factories were producing critical components and which supply routes were most vulnerable to interdiction. Allied strategic bombing campaigns targeted German industrial facilities based on information gathered from decoded German communications about production priorities and bottlenecks. The irony is that German security practices were otherwise excellent. German radio operators changed their daily machine settings precisely as ordered. German communications officers enforced strict protocols about message length and transmission timing. German cryptographers regularly updated encryption procedures to prevent pattern recognition. But none of these precautions mattered because the fundamental design assumption was wrong. The Germans had built their entire communication security around a machine that was systematically breaking itself with every message sent. After the war, captured German documents revealed that their engineers had considered allowing letters to encode as themselves during the original design phase. They rejected this option specifically because they thought it would weaken security. The decision was documented in technical specifications dated March 1939. One design choice, made by engineers who never saw combat, determined the outcome of military operations involving millions of soldiers across 3 continents. The technical documentation shows that German engineers spent months calculating the mathematical strength of different encryption approaches. They correctly determined that preventing letters from encoding as themselves would eliminate certain types of pattern analysis. What they didn't calculate was that this restriction would create new vulnerabilities that were even more dangerous than the ones they were trying to prevent. German engineers optimized their machine for the wrong threat. British codebreakers discovered additional ways to exploit the anti-reflection rule as the war continued. They realized that German weather reports always included specific technical terms in predictable locations. German naval messages always began with standardized call signs and date stamps. German army reports always ended with the sender's rank and unit identification. These routine elements became cribs that British cryptographers could use to test potential daily settings. The code-breaking process became increasingly automated as British engineers built electromechanical computers to test potential Enigma settings. By 1943, machines called bombs could test thousands of possible daily settings in minutes rather than hours. The anti-reflection rule made these machines much more efficient because they could eliminate impossible combinations without testing them. German engineers had unknowingly designed their encryption system to be broken by computers they didn't know existed. I kept that intelligence report from November 1944 in my personal files for decades after the war. It contained German defensive plans for the Metz fortifications that were less than 12 hours old when I read them. We attacked exactly where German intelligence had predicted we wouldn't, using routes that German engineers had classified as impossible for armored vehicles. Third Army broke through positions that the Germans considered impregnable because we knew precisely where their weaknesses were hidden. The Metz fortifications had been under construction for over a year when my Third Army arrived in November 1944. German engineers had built overlapping fields of fire and positioned their strongest defenses to cover the most obvious approaches. They had studied American tactical doctrine and positioned anti-tank guns where they expected American armor to attack. But German plans were based on the assumption that American commanders wouldn't know the exact locations of German strongpoints. That assumption was wrong. British intelligence provided Third Army with decoded German engineering reports showing which fortifications were incomplete, which gun positions had limited ammunition supplies, and which sectors had been weakened to provide troops for other fronts. We knew that the German 462nd Volksgrenadier Division was holding a front that normally required twice as many men. We knew that German artillery had only 30 rounds per gun because of supply shortages. Most importantly, we knew that German commanders expected us to attack from the southwest, where the terrain appeared most favorable for tanks. Instead, Third Army attacked from the northeast through terrain that German intelligence had classified as impassable. My armor advanced through forests and ravines that German engineers thought were natural tank barriers. We reached German rear positions before German forward observers knew we had begun the attack. The entire Metz fortress complex fell in 6 days because we had read the German defensive plan before German field commanders received their final orders. The young lieutenant who asked me that question outside Metz never learned the real answer until decades after the war ended. Most of the soldiers who benefited from Enigma intelligence never knew why their attack succeeded or why enemy resistance collapsed faster than anyone had predicted. The British kept their secret for 30 years after Germany surrendered. When the story finally emerged in the 1970s, it revealed that World War II had been 2 different conflicts simultaneously. The Germans fought the war they could see. We fought the war with their communications in our hands. Looking back, the most remarkable aspect of the Enigma story isn't the intelligence advantage it provided. It's how completely the Germans missed the source of their communications compromise. German security officers investigated possible espionage networks, suspected turned agents, and analyzed captured Allied equipment for signs of advanced radio intercept technology. They never seriously considered that their encryption machine had a fundamental design flaw, because their own cryptographers had proven mathematically that Enigma was unbreakable. German engineers conducted multiple security reviews of the Enigma system throughout the war. They tested the machine against various forms of attack and consistently concluded that breaking Enigma codes would require more computational resources than any enemy could possibly possess. Their calculations were correct about the computational requirements. They simply didn't know that British engineers were building machines specifically designed to meet those requirements. The final irony is that Germany had some of the world's best cryptographers and mathematicians. German scientists understood encryption theory as well as anyone in 1940. They built sophisticated mechanical calculators and developed advanced mathematical techniques for analyzing cipher systems. They had the theoretical knowledge to detect the anti-reflection flaw, but they never applied that knowledge to their own machines because they assumed German engineering was superior to anything the enemy could produce. That assumption cost Germany the war. Not the men who died fighting, or the cities that were bombed, or the resources that were exhausted. The war was lost in 1939 when German engineers decided that letters should never encode as themselves. Every battle afterward was just playing out the consequences of that single design decision. That's the reality of modern warfare. Victory often depends on technical details that soldiers in the field never understand. Engineering decisions made in peacetime determine tactical outcomes years later. The Germans lost World War II not because their soldiers fought poorly or their generals planned badly, but because their engineers made one small mistake when they designed their most important machine. Wars are won and lost in laboratories and engineering workshops, often by people who never hear the guns fire. Subscribe to channels like this one, because these stories vanish when nobody preserves them for the next generation who needs to understand how small decisions create massive consequences. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.